Ireland's inland waterways are renowned for their natural beauty and form some of the cleanest and richest river and lake systems in Europe. They are enjoyed by many different users: anglers, boat owners, kayakers, wildlife enthusiasts, and many more. The beautiful lakes, rivers and canals bring the visitor through some of the most scenic areas of the country. They attract millions of people annually. The relaxed pace is the perfect antidote to modern life. On many of the rivers and canals, people holiday aboard cruisers and barges, travelling from town to town along the water, a great way to relax and unwind. Anglers visit all of the river systems, attracted by the great fishing on offer. From the Atlantic salmon that return year after year for spawning and provide great sport to so many, to the miles and miles of canals which are very important to anglers, as they are rich in coarse fish, which gives anglers good quality and accessible fishing.
These areas really are special, and sometimes we take what we've got for granted because we pass it every day, or we go fishing there every day, or whatever. But when you travel across Europe, to find the big clean lakes like we have in the west of Ireland, full of wildlife, really clean water, that is genuinely special in any European context. And the same goes for rivers, because in general we have better water quality that supports more species. Very often we've got better fish life, and it's important, not just in Ireland but across Europe, that we look after this, because our long-term aim is to look after not just Irish biodiversity but across Europe and try to restore it, because we all know we've lost it, and it's about trying to get it back to where it was before.
Lough Corrib, over 18,000 hectares in size, is one of the most important salmon and wild brown trout fisheries in Europe. The Corrib catchment, with its many feeder streams, is a major nursery and spawning area for these fish. All of these waterways make up over 26,000 kilometres of rivers and 200,000 hectares of lakes. Although they are clean and rich in fish and wildlife, these waters are also very fragile ecosystems. The clean water feeding the lakes and rivers keeps the natural underwater vegetation, aquatic insects, fish and wildlife healthy. Lough Corrib is designated a special area of conservation. It includes 14 habitats listed in the EU Habitats Directive, 6 of which are priority habitats. It also is home to 10 species listed in the directive, including Atlantic salmon. Corrib's lime-rich waters support the most extensive beds of charophytes in Ireland, an important source of food for these species. This is a balanced ecosystem. The introduction of any non-native species would upset this balance with potentially catastrophic consequences. In 2005, IFI staff noticed a prolific growth of weed in Rinnaroon Bay. The presence of this weed could pose a threat to the natural charophytes in the area. Martin Butler went to investigate.
There was this weed spreading in a few of the bays, particularly Rinnaroon Bay, and we had a sample of it sent off to Joe Caffrey in fisheries in Dublin.
And without even opening the test tube, I knew we were dealing with something very different. Opened it up and recognised it as a plant called the curly-leaved waterweed, or Lagerosyphon major. This struck fear into me because I have seen it growing in abundance in other areas and impacting very severely on fisheries, on tourism, and even causing flooding problems.
Oh, the environmental impact was nearly to be seen at that stage, whereby it was making that particular bay, Rinnaroon Bay, unfishable.
This plant doesn't reproduce by seeds, it reproduces by fragments. So even through wave action or wind action, this plant would break up. And a fragment as small as the length of your finger is capable of floating off, settling down in another area, in another quiet bay, and producing a brand new population. We decided it was very important to set up a task force. This was set up very, very quickly. We were lucky that the groups we had around the table were able to dig deep and provide limited funding. You know, it was all that was available, but at least it got us started.
The first task was to determine the extent of the infestation. The 18,000 hectares of Lough Corrib were surveyed. Results showed that Lagrosiphon major was present in 9 bays. 2 methods were employed to control the weed: cutting and light exclusion. Lagrosiphon needs to be cut low at the root node in order to damage the plant. Cutting any higher would merely trim the weed and encourage further growth. V-blades were used to cut the plant along the lake bed, and this proved very successful. Surveys showed that this method killed 95% of the cut weed. The initial attempts at light exclusion were not as successful as cutting. Traditional methods used PVC plastic as the medium to block light to the plant. Normally it is used over very small areas. Attempting to lay it in larger areas of Lough Corrib was cumbersome, to say the least. The large pieces of plastic acted like sails in the wind. They were difficult to lay flat on the lake bed, and a build-up of gases as the plants died bubbled it to the surface of the lake, posing a hazard for boats. When it did kill the Lagrosiphon, it posed an environmental hazard and had to be removed from the lake. So, with the limited funding provided by the task force, the team established the extent of the Lagrosiphon infestation and had trialled 2 methods of dealing with the problem. More needed to be done to get the weed under control.
We realised that we were conducting trials in small areas. We were doing some very, very good work, but we hadn't got sufficient funding, and we knew we needed major funding.
Other special areas of conservation were discovered to be under threat by invasive species. Inland Fisheries Ireland and Waterways Ireland had found New Zealand pygmyweed in the Grand Canal in County Kildare. Staff from the National Parks and Wildlife Service and the Office of Public Works had come across Himalayan balsam on the banks of the River Barrow. Inland Fisheries Ireland and the National Parks and Wildlife Service made a submission to the European Commission's Life Plus Nature and Biodiversity Programme for funding to tackle these invasive species, and were successful. In January 2009, the CAISIE Life Plus project, control of aquatic invasive species and restoration of natural communities in Ireland, was initiated. Funded by the European Commission's Life Plus Nature and Biodiversity Programme, this is a 49-month project coordinated by Inland Fisheries Ireland, with support from the National Parks and Wildlife Service and the Office of Public Works. Its overall aims are to protect native biodiversity in Lough Corrib by controlling or containing Lagrosiphon major, to contribute to the halting of biodiversity loss in Ireland by preventing further impacts on biodiversity from high-impact aquatic invasive species in Lough Corrib, the Grand Canal and Barrow navigation, to develop informed guidelines for effective aquatic invasive species management, to implement a range of containment, control and eradication procedures in an effort to eliminate alien species from the targeted waters, to engage key stakeholders in an education and awareness programme. Being one of Ireland's largest rivers, the River Barrow has a lot of boat traffic and is also a very popular angling destination. It is recognised as being of significant ecological, conservation and recreational importance. During work conducted by staff from IFI and Waterways Ireland following some reports they were given, a very worrying find was made on this river system. the Asian clam.
The Asian clam, Latin name is Corbicula fluminea. As you can tell from the name, it's brought from Asia. Now, we're not exactly sure how it got here, but we only became aware of it in April 2010, so it's only about 2 years ago. And it's interesting that it's exactly at this point, right here at this riffle, that a shell of the Asian clam was found by a biologist doing some sampling. Fair play to him, he had it identified. It was identified as the Asian clam. It's regarded as one of the most notorious and widespread aquatic invasive species in the world. We're involved here in the European Life Project here and in other parts of the country. I brought my team down here because this area is also covered by that Life programme. And there's a team of divers, and what we said is we'd go in and we'd do some surveys and hopefully we'd find no live clam. Regrettably, that was not the case. We dived and within minutes we encountered hundreds, if not thousands, of live Asian clams. Well, the threat is a very, very serious threat, and caused by virtue of the fact that it's extremely prolific. The Asian clam is an extremely prolific beast. It's a real invasive in every sense. There are no male-female. It's hermaphrodite, so it can self-fertilise. Just one clam put into a new environment is capable of starting up a population. Each clam can produce up to 70,000 juveniles in 1 year. They have a lifespan of about 5 years. So what it means is that very, very quickly, very significant populations establish. And literally round the bend here, we have done some scientific analysis. We've checked the density of the population. And one of the larger counts we got was 9,400 and odd clams in 1 metre squared. So you can see it's a very, very dense population. When you look at that underwater, there is no riverbed. We have checked intensively the riverbed in this area. There are no native invertebrate species, so the native insects are all gone. There are no native plants. The native plants are all gone. And we reckon that these will have a very significant impact on the productivity of both trout and salmon, but they'll also very probably affect the conservation fish species that exist in this river. Farther upstream from us here, very close to us, the Thwaite shad comes into spawn, one of the only rivers in the country that comes into spawn. Smelt also use this area, and it certainly is my very strong opinion that the eggs released by these species are impacted by the filter feeding of the clam. We also feel that it could represent a significant flood hazard. As the populations increase, the shells are going to accumulate on shallow rivers, so there'll be less capacity for floods to dissipate. We've been working here for the last few days. We're after bringing in a cockle harvester from Passage East, and we're asking him to use a number of different trawl devices to take out as many clams as at all possible, just to see, one, can we reduce the population, and two, perhaps the disturbance might impact the clam. Again, we're learning all the time here. So what we're doing is we're doing a scientific evaluation of the merits of different dredge types. We're also considering other methods. We're in touch with experts in the States, in Europe and in Asia. We're thinking ahead to possible biocontrol. You know, maybe could we down the road introduce a parasite that might be specific to the Asian clam. Always a dangerous thing, but I think we're going to have to think that way, because they are so numerous and so prolific that it might be the only way to deal with them.
Another invasive species, also found along the Barren navigation, is Himalayan balsam. This is a plant whose origin is in India and in the western Himalayas. It colonizes riverbanks, forming large canopies. It competes with Ireland's native vegetation and can grow up to 3 meters in height. Being so tall, it blocks out the light needed by other native plants. When it dies back in the autumn, riverbanks can be left bare, and are susceptible to erosion, flooding and even bank collapse. The approach the CAISIE Life Plus team took with Himalayan balsam was to organise various user groups and stakeholders along the river systems to take away the balsam by means of pulling it from the ground. Balsam bashes were organised, and these have been a great success.
And we're here to clean away an invasive species called Himalayan balsam.
A lot of work has been done in England, and they found out that by simply pulling the balsam, it has a very shallow root, by simply pulling it, you can remove that plant and it will not grow again. If you get it before it seeds, there will be no seeds. So you can theoretically eradicate this plant. So we've been explaining the benefits of simply pulling this weed, putting it into heaps and allowing it rot down. We will look after that element of it. And what we find is that the stakeholders, being the anglers in this case, and the local communities, with the Irish Wildlife Trust, and we have local community groups here. And what we are trying to encourage is for more stakeholders and more communities to become involved. We can beat this plant, and this plant is expanding very, very rapidly, but it requires perseverance. And we as fisheries people cannot do it on our own. Unless we get the backing of the stakeholders and the backing of the communities, it will not work.
Along the Grand Canal in the Irish Midlands, one very unwelcome visitor is New Zealand pygmy-weed. This was discovered in a short stretch near Lowtown in County Kildare. This weed was introduced as an ornamental species for use in the horticultural trade. It can grow in up to 2 meters of water and also out of water. It flourishes in suitable habitat and will overgrow all native plant species. Soon water columns will be choked, and this will affect the movement of fish and also clog the engines of boats and barges. Waterways Ireland and Inland Fisheries Ireland acted quickly when this was discovered. The 2-kilometre stretch in question was identified, and a plan to remove the weed was developed. With the use of divers, the CAISIE team are removing this fast-growing weed and are monitoring the area on a regular basis. The largest part of the CAISIE project is the control of the lagroscypon infestation on Lough Corrib. With the Life Plus funding, a team was put together and a base was established on the loch. The resources were now in place to tackle lagroscypon on a larger scale. Prior to CAISIE, 2 methods were trialled to control lagroscypon major in Lough Corrib: cutting and light exclusion. The methods employed for cutting were quite successful. However, the use of PVC plastic for light exclusion was proving more difficult. An alternative method would have to be found in order to have any success. A possible solution was discovered by Dr. Joe Caffrey, not on Lough Corrib, but at roadworks on the M50, Dublin's main ring road.
I was stuck in traffic, stopped, and I noticed to my left a rock face had been exposed, but it had been covered with what I deemed at the time was jute matting. And I was just puzzled by it and looking at it, and realised that this was probably impregnated with seed and was going to grow on site. But what struck me at the time was a wet evening, that this jute looked very, very heavy. And it brought me back to Lough Corrib. And I thought maybe if we could get large sheeting like this, rather than the black plastic that will sit on the water, that this will actually saturate quickly, will sink and be sufficiently heavy to compress the lagroscypon. Not only that, it would probably also block sufficient light that would kill the plant.
Rolls of jute were procured, and within 2 months, the first attempts at using the material began. This was a very innovative approach, and the team were pioneering this revolutionary method. Initially, the jute was applied from large rolls that were laid out over the lake bed from the back of a boat. The boats were not perfect for the job, as they were quite narrow at the stern. It was trial and error. But with persistence, the jute was laid. With time and the experience gained, the process was refined.
Today we're working in Anodown Bay in Lough Corrib, and we're using one of the two principal methods we use to target this highly invasive Lagrosiphon major weed. Jute matting is typically carried out from the late spring to late autumn period, when the weed has collapsed to the lake floor. Unlike traditional benthic barrier weed control methods, which typically employ plastic or PVC sheeting, this jute matting is a biodegradable and organic fabric. It saturates on contact with water. It doesn't have to be removed at the end of the control season, and it biodegrades naturally within 7 to 18 months. The Lagrosiphon major that is under the fabric typically dies within 2 months. What the weed control team do here is they identify a site and they mark it out. The control team is made up of 5 members, 3 on the boat and 2 divers. The 2 guys in the boat attach weights to the jute matting and feed it out to the divers. Scuba divers are essential to this jute matting process. They can target the patches of Lagrosiphon underwater and ensure that the fabric is laid directly over them. They can stretch out the fabric and weight it down so it's flush against the lake floor. And they also lay mats side by side, and they can stitch them together to ensure there's no gaps between which otherwise the Lagrosiphon could grow back up through.
The results of the jute laying were spectacular. It did, as expected, kill the Lagrosiphon, but it did more, much more than kill the plant. After 2 months, the team monitoring the treated areas noticed something completely unexpected. Seeds of the native charophytes germinated and were growing through the mesh of the jute. Within 10 months, areas where the material was laid were free of Lagrosiphon and being recolonized by the native plants, and the jute was biodegrading. As the CAISIE team gained experience in the cutting and jute laying processes, they built up a lot of expertise and were improving efficiency and productivity. It became clear that the existing glass fibre boats were limiting the cutting process. Their size restricted the amount of weed that could be harvested. The glass fibre hulls were constantly damaged by rocks on the shoreline while landing to unload Lagrosiphon. It was clear that in order to increase productivity and allow larger volumes of weed to be cut, new boats suitable for the task were needed. Larger aluminium boats were procured. These boats would also improve the jute laying process. This made the job for the team on the water a lot easier. The new boats were more stable. They could hold much more weed after cutting, allowing the team to be more efficient in disposing of the quantities of weed. The front of one of the boats was fitted with a special drop-down ramp, making the unloading process safer and faster.
So one of the things that the funding allowed us was to conduct the research that we hadn't been able to conduct in the past, because while it is terribly important to be out there cutting and removing weed or covering it and killing it, it's also very important to understand what makes the plant tick. Why is it so aggressive in a lake like Lough Corrib? Why is it growing in certain parts of the lake and not in others? You've got to learn about the plant. And one of the objectives of the research is to find weak links. Every invasive species has a weak link somewhere in its life cycle, and it was up to us to find that and to target it. So that work has been ongoing over a number of years, and we've been very lucky, and we have found weak links that we are targeting. But it has also provided the funding to allow us buy-in resource, be it boats, be it diving equipment, be it the assistance of external crews to help us with the actual physical removal.
Another part of the research in the CAISIE project is being done in conjunction with scientists in University College Dublin. Biocontrol is a measure that may be used in the future to tackle invasive species, and Dr. Jan Robert Baars is leading the team's investigations. With the funding from the CAISIE project, it is now possible for this research to be carried out.
The general concern about using biological control is that people perceive it as bringing in another non-native species that could potentially become invasive, and that's not the case in biological control. In classical biological control, when we do the research for the CAISIE project, we're really concerned about being very rigorous about our testing, and we make sure that that natural enemy will only feed on the target species and will not have an impact on our native species. So there's no concern once we go through the rigorous testing that where we expose the native species to the insect, that once we understand the association with the plant, we know that it's specific, we can make an application for its permission to be released in Ireland, but only when we really know that it will not have a risk to our native biota. We've tested several agents now. We know that we've brought in 4 species. 2 of the species are new to science, and we now understand their biology. We know it's a host association. We know that both of those insects are very damaging on the plant. It looks like one of the agents may not be specific enough, although it does an incredible amount of damage. Looks really promising. We don't think we'll get to a stage where we can actually release it, because we see that some of our native species are at risk during very conservative trials. But we are at a stage with one of the insects, which is a leaf mining fly, where we know its biology, we know its host association, and we know that it's very specific. So there are 1 or 2 more trials that we'd like to run. But at this stage, we're very close to looking for a permission to release. And it's only because we have had the funding from the Life Plus CAISIE project that we can actually afford to do this research, looking at alternative methods of controlling lagrosiphon.
During the course of the CAISIE project, the team have identified the extent of invasive species in the special areas of conservation covered. They have developed methods of control and have engaged stakeholders. In all the designated areas, they have put in place measures to help control the further spread of these invasive species. Over 90% of the original 92-hectare lagarosiphon infestation has been treated. Native species have re-established in treated areas after weed control. Previously infested areas have been reopened for angling and boating. A rapid reaction capability to respond to new threats of invasive species in Lough Corrib has been implemented. Weed control operations have prevented the spread of the weed to the lower section of Lough Corrib. New control methods have been developed. Jute matting for invasive species control is now being used in Ireland and internationally. Good progress has been made to identify a suitable biological agent to control lagarosiphon. Survey methods were developed to monitor the colonisation and efficacy of the control measures. A herbarium of indigenous macrophyte flora of Lough Corrib has been prepared. The distribution of aquatic invasive species in the Grand Canal and Barrow Navigation have been established. New control methods have been successfully developed or adapted. All sites with giant hogweed, Japanese knotweed, New Zealand pygmyweed and Nuttall's pondweed on the Grand Canal and Barrow Navigation have been treated. Himalayan balsam has been contained in the Barrow Navigation below Athy. Dace have been prevented from entering the main Grand Canal channel. Native species have re-established in treated areas. Control trials have been conducted on the Asian clam, and this work will be expanded in future. A detailed appraisal has increased the understanding of how aquatic invasive species are introduced into and spread in Irish waterways. Targeted initiatives have been developed to limit the further introduction or spread of aquatic invasive species. CAISIE have driven aquatic invasive species biosecurity policy in Ireland and within Inland Fisheries Ireland. Education and awareness material has been produced and circulated to stakeholders. Approximately 70 events to promote biosecurity have been attended throughout Ireland during the project. CAISIE drove the mandatory disinfection of angling gear at 2 international angling competitions. A suite of practical tools for stakeholders to tackle any future invasions of aquatic invasive species have been developed.
The CAISIE project has been a great demonstration project for Europe in that it showed that we can actually tackle invasive species in a lake where they had become established. And this was done through research, which was very, very important, in that we were able to look at the weaknesses of the invader and tackle those through innovative research and development project, which allowed us to develop jute matting, which is a major innovation that has been used around the world and may be used further in Europe to tackle the threat of invasive species. It also has raised awareness greatly in Ireland, particularly around the communities of Lough Corrib and the Barrow navigation channels. It's also been raised in the European Parliament, where we were invited of late to present to the European Parliament on issues associated with invasive species to support their development of pending legislation to tackle this threat. The CAISIE project has been a very successful project, both in Irish terms and in European terms, and we need to build on that success. And to that regard, we have started the Afterlife programme, where we will look at addressing specific issues around Corrib, continuing the stakeholder engagement and continuing to build awareness around the issue of invasive species. We are looking at development of national and supporting development of EU policy with respect to invasive species. And that deals with issues like horizon viewing, vector analysis, biosecurity, and working with government and state agencies to ensure that their legislation supports addressing the threat of invasive species.
Ireland's special areas of conservation are amongst the most important in Europe. Their continued protection is the responsibility of us all, user groups and state agencies alike. It is vital that funding is secured into the future in order to ensure that the valuable expertise gained during the CAISIE project is used to preserve these fragile environments. These ecosystems are far too precious to lose and must be protected. They're important not just to us who enjoy using them for pleasure, but to the natural world and all its mammals, insects, flora and fish.